So Carl and his family are currently en route to the airport. They are going away for the weekend, or for the week, excuse me. And so they send their love, but are looking forward to some time together and a little bit of rest. And so today you are stuck with me. And this morning I want to teach. So Carl told me, I'm going to teach this week. I'm also going to teach next week, actually. And Carl said, you can come up with your own little thing. And so then this is what I came up with. And I'm calling it Becoming. And it's based on, there's this guy named Andy Stanley. He's a pastor on the East Coast, and he's written a book called Irresistible. And the premise of the book is this, that there was a time when Jesus and the church were irresistible. People were doing everything they could to get connected and be involved, to the point that, especially for a big chunk of the early part of the church, under heavy persecution, sneaking away and risking their lives to be a part of the church. And then this author's kind of fast forward to now and says, it doesn't seem that it's the same irresistibility it used to have. Would you agree? And his question is this, what changed? And so part of his idea, part of what he came away with is that Jesus didn't change, and the Bible hasn't changed, but that we have changed. And the premise of the book is all about trying to return back to being the kind of people that are irresistible when it comes to showing other people God's love. Does that make sense? And so this morning I want to take a look at that. And to do that, I've got this metaphor. My brother Jake just came back from Australia. He was there for 2 years with this organization called YWAM, which is Youth with a Mission. And he just got back. And on Monday, he was down here visiting us. Australian people they just say stuff weird. And so he just got a job, and he asked me this question. He said, Josh, do people in America get paid fortnightly? And I said, that's a video game. And I don't know what that means. And he said, fortnightly. I said, no, I don't. He said, twice a month. I said, we have a different word for that here. He goes, well, in Australia. I said, no one cares. You're not in Australia anymore. Get over it. But he told me this, and I thought this was incredibly interesting. It's a metaphor that I think has a lot, at least for me. And so in Australia, there are cattle ranchers, right? These guys that have all this cattle. And so, by the way, these are some really high-quality graphics. So you have a field with cattle, right? You with me? And one of the things they have to do, these ranchers, is to keep the cattle on their field and not, roaming out in the open or on other people's property. You with me so far? And so there's two ideas of how to do this. The first one is, understandably, at the front end, is much less expensive. And that is to install a fence. And when you install a fence, then it kind of gives the cows a clear area to be and not to be, right? But here's what they've found happens, is that cows will start wherever they are when the fence goes up. And the cows, pretty much their whole existence is searching for food. And so they will walk around this land, and they will typically start in one spot and just kind of keep progressing as they eat all the food in an area. There's no more food. They'll keep going until eventually they reach what? Fence. And then they reach this conundrum, because there is no more food on their side of the fence, but there is food outside. And so guess what they do? They're cows. They go through the fence, right? And so it's understood it's going to be a lot cheaper on the front end to put in a fence. But putting in a fence, you understand that with that comes, you're going to have to constantly repair the fence. Right? You with me? Okay. Then the second way is to not do a fence, but instead just to put a well in the middle of the property. Because when you have a well in the middle of the property and you bring that water up to the surface, what happens is there's tons of life and growth right around that well, right? And then why would cows leave? They stay at the well. You with me? And so this is where I think this metaphor really clicks for me, is that, so I want to try and give a quick overview of the Bible from 30,000 feet. And here's what it is. So God made man, put us in a garden, gave us one job, man and woman, gave us one job, screwed it up, right? Don't eat from this fruit, so what do? We ate the fruit, right? And so then we're disconnected from God at that point. We get kicked out of the garden. And humanity then goes through, is disconnected from God. And so God reaches out to humanity, and he does it two ways. First, there's this guy named Abraham. If you've ever gone to children's church, you sang about him. He was a father. He had many sons. You may have even danced. And this guy, God makes this promise to him that through you, I'm going to bless the world. And your descendants are going to be incredibly numerous. But through you, through your offspring, I'm going to impact the entire world. And then 430-ish years later, this guy named Moses comes along, goes to the top of this mountain, and God gives him 613 laws. And thus begins what is known as the Old Covenant, or contract's a better way to think of it maybe. The Old Contract. And here was the contract. You obey these laws, and I, God, will bless you as a people. Does that make sense? Pretty straightforward, right? Has anyone else ever noticed the irony that God gave in the garden one law, we screwed it up, and so the next idea was, let's try 613 at the same time. Really? And guess what? Humanity can't keep 600. If we can't do one, how could we ever hope to do 613? And the entire Old Testament is filled with story after story of the people breaking the law, and then returning back to God, and then breaking the law. In the analogy we talked about, what constantly is broken and repaired? Fence. And so to me, the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament idea is the fence. And can I tell you something? There's a lot of comfort sometimes found in the fence. Because I know exactly where I stand. And I know exactly where you stand. If you're inside the fence, you and God are good. But if you step outside the fence, now you and God aren't good. And if I'm inside the fence and you're outside the fence, I'm better than you. Right? It's very definitive. I like that. I like clearly understood boundaries, right? That just makes things so much easier. And fences do that. They're very clear, understood boundaries. At some point, the old covenant wasn't going to work. We kept breaking the law. We kept breaking the fence. And so in the middle of literally time, right around the time that BC goes to AD, most people think AD 29, Jesus dies on a cross. As he's on the cross, he says these words, "It is finished." There was a guy a couple months ago that actually spoke about what those words meant. One of the things I think those words meant was the old contract is done. And now, connection with God is no longer about obeying 613 laws, or rather how well you're doing at obeying the 613, and instead shifts to a relationship with someone who obeyed all 613 perfectly and then died in your place. And so now, there's no 613, there's no like, well, if you want to be connected to God, you have to do, no, God put a well right in the middle of, but understand, for the rancher, a well is super expensive, right? And similarly, I think the well that God installed in humanity called Jesus was super costly. It cost him everything. It was his son. And now, this new covenant, this new contract going forward, is solely based on our relationship with Jesus. That's it. And here's what this author, the author of that book, he says one of the reasons that we are no longer irresistible is because we believe in the new covenant or the new contract, but we also like to pull some of the old contract with us. For example, okay, but you can't really be a Christian if you are a Democrat, right? And can I tell you something? Absolutely, of course you can. But you can't be a Christian if you smoke pot. Well, I don't know how to say this to you, but we don't work with a fence anymore. And can I tell you something? The well is really uncomfortable because it is really messy. Who's in? And it's hard to, I mean, those that have a relationship with Jesus, sometimes they don't look like me. They don't obey all the laws like I do either, right? I just am good at acting. But am I wrong? Come on. But we don't like it when people are different than us. But this new contract's real messy because people can be very different than us and very much connected to Jesus. Right? And so I like to mix the old and the new. And I have this minimum standard for righteousness that others need to meet to be welcome at the well. And Jesus doesn't work that way. And so what I want to do today is I want to look at 4 things that I think are true of people who are at the well. And let me be very clear on the front end. I'm not advocating for this like everyone's in, there's no requirements. That's not true. But what I am advocating is that the new covenant, the new contract is faith and God's grace alone. No old contract is part of it. Matter of fact, that's why Jesus, when he was on earth, said these words, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law of prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, to fulfill them." Because, and Paul says this, that the promises to Abraham were spoken to Abraham first, and then if you skip down a little bit, what I mean is this, the law was introduced 430 years later. God's original plan was that through Abraham would come Jesus, and that's the new covenant. And then in the meantime, he gives the law. But the promise came first. Does that make sense? And then the law comes second. And so the long-term end game is not relationship with God through law, but relationship with God through Jesus. And that's the shift. That's the new contract, the new covenant. And for those that have made that decision, I think there's 4 things that begin to become true of us. And so here's the first one. I think people at the well don't allow their anxiety to turn to worry. Originally, when I wrote this point, I said people at the well aren't anxious and don't worry. And then I thought, that's dumb. Have you ever been in a situation where, and you may not even be aware why at the time, but you start to notice your heart rate elevates, and you maybe start perspiring a little bit, maybe even get a little shaky, you can feel you're kind of more aware than you would normally be? You ever been in that situation? That's anxiety. Did you choose that? And so anxiety is fairly involuntary. You don't get to choose in a moment if you feel anxious or not. But what you can choose is whether you're going to go down that path of anxiety or whether you're going to remind yourself of what God's already promised in the Bible. Because if you go down the path of anxiety, you end up at worry. And can I tell you, as a professional worrier, that worry makes you lack or doubt God and assume the worst in others. Like worry always makes me doubt God and assume the worst in other people. But those at the well, so I had this thought. Imagine, by the way, I don't know if you've picked this up, but I've subtly called this all cattle. I don't know if anybody else was like, yeah, wait a minute. You're welcome. But let's imagine for a second we're like the rancher, and let's imagine you put a well in your property, and you have a cow, and it dies of starvation at the well. How would you feel about that cow? I would think the cow is dumb. Am I the only one? I would think the cow is dumb. You died in food. You starved and collapsed into the food. And not only that, the way God designed you, you often are looking down. How did you miss it? It was right there. And this idea of like, if you were a cow at a well, would you ever worry about food? No, because you may not understand this, but you're at a place that is producing food. And there's this guy, this author, who said this, that when we begin to see God like Jesus does, worrying about tomorrow's food will become as foolish as worrying about whether or not the sun's going to rise tomorrow. And I had this realization. I've worried about, I have this ability to just imagine the worst case scenario at almost any given point. I've never worried if the sun was going to rise. I never have. Maybe my greatest act of faith is that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar, right? That tomorrow. But really, have you ever worried about the sun rising? I never have. And then I had this thought, which takes more work? The sun or me having what I need? And the answer, of course, is I think the sun, but I'm not a real sciencey guy, so I'm a pastor. There's a reason. Jesus said this at one point, therefore I tell you, don't worry about your life, what you're going to eat or your drink, or your body and what you're going to wear. Isn't life more than food in your body? Look at the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than that? Or is humanity more valuable than birds? Yeah, I would say so. And then can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Can you? No. Matter of fact, when you worry, that's right. If nothing else, the hours you spent worrying, you just gave those ones away, right? And so maybe another way to look at this, there was a point, some of you know Jeff and Jen Stemple, and they have 3 daughters. And at one point I had a conversation with one of their daughters after church, and she looked at me and she said this. She said, Josh, literally, there is no food in our house. And I said, I bet you $100 there's food in your house. And she said, deal, and we shook on it. Guess what was in their house? Food. And at that time, they had this dog named Buddy. And they fed Buddy. And I had this realization. If you're a kid in a family, and they're feeding the dog, what can you probably assume to be true about you? That at least you're going to get dog food, right? Like, that's the bare minimum. And why? Because which is more important, children or dogs? And it, of course, depends on the day. But typically, we say kids. Because you don't get a tax deduction for dogs. Right? And I feel like Jesus sometimes looks and goes, I made the sun come up. You're really worried about some food? I got you. Does that make sense? And I think those that live at the well, it's not that we don't get anxious, we do. But it's that we take that anxiety to Jesus and trust what he says. That he will provide. If he provides for the birds, how much more us? And so I think that's one thing that's true of people that live at the well, and not people that live at the fence. Because when you're at the fence, you should worry. You should constantly worry, because it is only a matter of time before food becomes scarce. Right? And then you have to start to go, what am I willing to do to get? But at the well, it's constantly replenished. Second thing I think is that people at the well are unconcerned with comparison. Because why would I be if there's not scarcity of food? Why would I be if the new covenant's true and I have a relationship with Jesus, and as far as God and I are concerned, I'm in right standing with him? Not because of what I've done, but because of Jesus. Why would I be comparing myself to other people? And I think it's because, and this is something I said earlier, that I have in my mind, it's different from all of yours, but I have what I perceive to be a minimum standard of righteousness that everyone has to at least do. And it never comes out verbally like that. Matter of fact, it rarely comes out verbally, but in my head, it comes out this way. If they were really a Christian, they would ... or more typically, they would not ... right? And that's what I said. Fences make things easy to define. You can't be a Christian, why not? You're outside the fence. This is easy. You can't be a Christian, why not? Well, because there's no fence, but there's a well, and you're a little further from the well. So? Is that right? Proximity to the well does not make us... Anyway. And so this idea of comparison, Jesus, with this new covenant, throws it out. Matter of fact, it's something that's actually present throughout the Bible. You get glimpses of it, but it really comes to light when you see Jesus in the New Testament. He says things like, the greatest among you will be the one that's the servant. Play that comparison game. I remember when I was a kid, they taught us that, and so then it became like a competition to like, nobody ever exited a door because we were all trying to open the door for each other so that we could become better. Like the root cause was to be better, right? But we we have to be a servant. I will outserve you so I can be the best. It's like, I don't think that's what Jesus meant. I could be wrong. Jesus, at one point, there's this guy, and he's trying to anoint the next king of Israel, and so he goes to this family. God tells him there's this family, all these kids. And so the dad brings out the kids one at a time based on like the most able and best looking. He starts with the oldest and goes down the line, and each one, this prophet sees him, it's like, goes and talks to God. God's like, no. The next one, to the point that he's exhausted all the sons. And he asked this question, which is great, because I think he had like 9 sons. And at the end of looking at all 9 of these sons, he goes, don't you have any more kids? Which I just think is great, like as if 9's not enough, right? And sure enough, he's like, well, there's this guy in the field, but it couldn't be him. And he's like, we will not sit till he shows up. They bring in this teenager who's been out in the fields tending sheep for a couple days. Sure enough, God's like, that's the one. But as God's rejecting all these ones that would look to make great kings, God says this, don't consider his appearance or his height because I have rejected him. Because, see, God looks at things, doesn't look at things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but God looks at what? Heart. It's really easy to compare my action to yours. It's almost impossible to compare my heart to yours, right? So I think when we play the comparison game, we're comparing the wrong stuff. Matter of fact, if we're going to play the comparison game, I don't actually advocate for not playing the comparison game. I think we just need to change who we compare ourselves to. And that is, compare yourself to Jesus, and you'll walk with humility your whole life. And I think people at the well do that. They are reminded that this well did not come from them, that someone put this in, and they remember that. There's no comparison necessary. We all enjoy the well. That's the second thing. Third thing I think is this, that people at the well are more interested in who they're becoming rather than what they're doing. Or I want to say it this way. I should have changed it this way. People at the well are more interested in who they're becoming than in what they should do. And I think that this is something Jesus engages with a lot. And there was certainly a lot of people that, especially at Jesus' time because he hadn't died, they clung tightly to the 613. But what's interesting is it wasn't just the 613. There's actually more. And there's a story in Mark 7 I want to share with you. It says this, the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law, so Pharisees were like the super religious guys of the day. Matter of fact, at one point, there's this Pharisee who prays out loud, thank you, God, that I'm not like, and then names the guy next to him, which that's a bold move, right? Like to out loud, thank God that you're not as bad as whoever's sitting next to you at that moment. Again, out loud. What do you say if you're the other guy? Like, you're an egotistical person. Like, I don't know what you say. And so these guys, these religious guys, had come from Jerusalem, gathered around Jesus, saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled or unwashed. So the Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. Holding to the tradition of who? Is this a command from God? Correct. So when they come from the marketplace, they don't eat unless they wash. Does this make sense? You ever been to a flea market? Like pick stuff up, set things down, right? Do all that. And then you ever gone out to lunch after a flea market? What's the first thing you do when you get to the restaurant? Why? Because you have no idea where the flea market things have been and come from and who else has touched them, right? You can probably guess everyone. At that point, you're all connected. And so this makes tons of sense, right? And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups or pitchers and kettles. Jesus talks about this in points. So being a millennial, I YouTubed this, and I found a video on how the Jews wash their hands when they're getting ready to eat bread. Let's take a look.
If a person's going to be having bread, then they need to wash their hands. Now, if they're having less than a egg's worth, in other words, if you're having less than, let's say, 2 pieces of bread, you should probably wash without a bracha bread. If your ring has a stone in it, then you definitely need to remove it. Now, as we demonstrate, I will be talking. Of course, usually you don't talk when you wash your hands. It's particularly important not to talk from the time you begin the washing until the blessing is made. Never do we interrupt between a mitzvah and its blessing. Let's say afterwards, it's also important not to interrupt between the washing and the eating bread. But that's actually less significant. The main thing is not to interrupt between the washing and the making of the blessing. So if we want to pour the water on our hands, we want it to cover all the way from our wrist, all the way to the very ends of the fingertips. In order to do that, we're going to need a significant amount of water. So it's good to fill up a nice big cup. If you use a small cup, this is going to be very difficult to do. If you're in a shortage of water, you could follow a more lenient position of covering just simply up to the knuckles. So we do it as follows. You hold the hand this way so that everything is exposed. Your hand is totally exposed to the water. And you pour it twice. Hand is completely covered with water. Then we would take the towel, hold our hands up, and say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech olam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. And then we dry the hands. You do not make a blessing while you're drying your hands. That wouldn't be proper. You should focus on the blessing. You shouldn't make a blessing after you dry your hands, because then it's completely over. Rather, you should make the blessing before you dry your hands. You also try to hold the hands up so that if there is any water, it falls down on your wrist and not the other way around. The water from above your wrist is impure, and you wouldn't want it to fall below the wrist and then to fall on top of the wrist. That would be improper. So we want to keep the hands up when we're drying our hands. You dry them, you remain silent, and then you've accomplished the washing of the hands.
What was missing? And so that was a 6-minute video. You're welcome. Cut it down a little for you. B, did you catch how many rules there are to washing your hands? And I'm not trying to make fun of the Jewish tradition, but that's a lot of rules. And if you have a ring and then you have to say things a certain time. Anyway, I think you'll never wash your hands the same. But that's what these guys are talking about when they say to Jesus, they see him eating after they've been through the marketplace. You're not going to wash your hands? And it's kind of like, what? Yeah, now they're wet. Oh, great. Now the germs are in the water. Like what? Anyway, and so so the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders? Not commands of God, traditions of other human beings. Instead of eating their food with defiled hands. Because, after you run water over them, then... Yeah. Jesus replies, Isaiah was this prophet. He wrote this book 850 years before Jesus was even around. And so Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. If you're ready to do like a negotiation or try and do conflict well, this is a poor start. You hypocrites. Just right out of the gate. As it is written, these people will honor me with their lips, but their hearts will be far from me. They worship me in vain, and their teachings are merely what? Did you catch that? And then Jesus goes on and says, you've let go of the commands of God and instead are holding on to human traditions. Not just accepting the new covenant and the new contract, but holding to the old contract just as much. And not, like, there's God's commands, which are to love God and to love people. And to be the greatest, we must be a servant. And sometimes we replace that with stuff that we like. Or at least I do it with stuff that I like. And then Jesus goes on and he says this. You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, honor your father and mother. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. I have to be honest, if we were going to bring an Old Testament law back, this might be one I think we should bring back. Maybe all of that and this. He goes on, he says, but you say that if anyone declares what might have been used to help their father or mother is Corban, or devoted to God, that you no longer let them do anything for their father and mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your own tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that. So here's what Jesus is referring to. There's the tithe in the Old Testament, 10% of your, if you were a farmer, 10% of your crop, 10%, there were different tithes. This isn't talking about that. In that day, one of the loopholes to taking care of people was you could say, well, I've devoted this money to God. And if you did that, you didn't actually have to give it to God, but people understood it was a really holy way of saying no to someone. And so people, when their father and mother would have a need and be asking for finances, would basically go, sorry, this money is earmarked for God. And like, what parent's going to be like, you should ditch that whole thing and just give me the money, right? Like, it's a pretty good excuse. And so they found a loophole. And Jesus' point is this, you're going to give me a hard time over hand rinsing, but you don't even follow the commands of God. Not only do you not follow them, you found loopholes. And Jesus' point is, you've replaced the commands of God with human tradition. And that's not a positive thing. And I'm convinced sometimes I do the same thing. And that's why people at the well are more interested in who they're becoming rather than what they should do. Because what Jesus should have done is washed his hands. But what Jesus did do was honor God with his heart. Not through some action, but through everything he does. Now, this also gets kind of murky. I'm leading this Bible study on James right now, and James says, it's great that you say you believe something. You got to prove it. You got to have action that backs that up. And I agree wholeheartedly. But there's got to be some level of, when you're just going through things for the motions, right? You're doing it because you should. That's not, people at the well are interested in that. People in the well are interested in who they're becoming. And then the last thing I think is true of people who live at the well is that they live with joy. I heard this guy recently give this really uplifting message. He said that one of the things that's become very popular in our culture is to just be really critical of everything. Have you noticed that at some point? Right? And so it's just easy to criticize. And there's a lot of negativity to criticize, right? And so he said the problem with the people that are just that criticize, they don't actually try and jump in and do something about it. He said one of the things that's really tough about that is that those people miss out on the truth that it's way worse than they think it is. And he said this, at the end of it all, everyone dies. So if you think this is bad, it gets worse. And his point was to live with joy, and here's why. There's this guy named Solomon. He was very wise, and he wrote a number of books in the Bible, but the last one he wrote is this book called Ecclesiastes. And it can seem really negative or almost even like apathetic about life, but I think it's actually just a really, like I think that at his age, given what he'd done in his life, he had a really clear perspective on life as it really is. And he writes this, I've seen another evil under the sun, and it weighs heavily on mankind. God gives some people wealth, possessions, and honor, so that they lack nothing their hearts desire. But God does not grant them the ability to enjoy those things, and strangers enjoy them instead. This is a meaningless and grievous evil. A man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive proper burial, which meant like if people don't come out to attend his burial, if he didn't live in such a way that people want to be there at the end, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. And here's what he's saying. God has blessed us with stuff. And sometimes it is so easy to be so focused on what we don't have and chasing that we actually miss out on enjoying what God's already blessed us with. And this guy's opinion was that it's better to be someone, that to live a life where you have all these children, live all these years, but never enjoy any of it, that it would actually be better just to have not existed. And this speaker goes on to basically say this, that joy is choosing to enjoy what God has already blessed me with, rather than being focused on what God hasn't blessed me with. There's this thing called the Talmud. It's a bunch of Jewish rabbis got together in the 5th century and wrote a commentary on the Old Testament. So this is not the Bible. This is just some Jewish rabbi's thought. But I really love this line. He said, "At the day of judgment, everyone will be called to account for all the legitimate pleasures which he or she has failed to enjoy." And I thought, that's interesting. And this is not the Bible. I want to be very clear about that. But God's blessed us with a lot of stuff. And sometimes I'm so focused on what he didn't bless me with that I miss out on enjoying what he did. Sometimes I'm so focused on what I lack, I don't enjoy what I've got. And I think people at the well are so unconcerned with what they don't have because all their needs are currently met, right? They have everything they need. And so, at the end of this, I have a question and I have a thought. And I'll start with the thought. Maybe it's possible that the reason why Jesus seems less irresistible now than he used to is because people like me, who believe God's grace alone, relationship with God alone, the new contract, the new covenant, but then I also subject people to some rules that I've made up. Maybe. And maybe you can relate. Maybe you subject yourself to those same rules. What I can tell you is this, that Jesus' death and resurrection in the middle of the Bible, in the middle of time, introduced a brand new covenant. And that covenant is not about 613 laws. That covenant is about a relationship with him. It is a come to the well and live here. Jesus at one point actually is teaching, and in that day, these rabbis, these teachers, would have their own interpretation of the law. And we get this, right? Murder is not simply murder. There are different interpretations of murder. It can be in self-defense. It can be premeditated. And so how you understand the law was very important back then. And so the rabbis would teach on how to understand the 613 rules that Moses was given. And Jesus, they called that, by the way, their yoke. And to follow a rabbi was to believe in or see the law through the yoke of that rabbi. Does that make sense? So you would choose the interpretation of a rabbi if you followed him the way they understood the law. And Jesus says this, his yoke, his understanding of the law is easy. His burden is light. The reason for it is because the 613 laws now no longer are how I connect to God. They are simply my relationship with him. And so to that end, my question to you is this. Do you identify with any of these? Are any of these challenging? Sometimes is it tough to not take your anxiety to Jesus and remind yourself that you live at a well? And I'll be honest, I think sometimes the more legalistic I get, the more I go towards the fences, and the more I go towards the fences, I become a really legalistic person. It's not very pretty. Or maybe you're like me and you play the comparison game. Sometimes it just feels good to compare yourself to someone else. It's not fair or loving, but it feels good. Or maybe you feel weighed down by all the things that you should do. We've tried to make the word should in my house like illegal. It's just, there's so much that I do out of should, and I don't think there's much I should do that I enjoy. There's not a whole lot of life that comes from doing the shoulds. Or maybe you're like me, and God's blessed you a bunch, and you're more focused on what he hasn't given you. Or you're more focused on taking what he's blessed you with and turning it into more. And maybe this week we need to be reminded that we need not worry. And we need not compare. And instead we just need to focus on us and who God's making us to be. Not becoming a person who should do the right things or does things because they should, but instead becoming the kind of person who does the right things because that's just the kind of person you are. And because of that, we live with joy. Because I can enjoy what God's given me right now. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff tomorrow. I got to take care of it, but I can take care of it tomorrow. For now, I'm going to pause and thank God and enjoy what he's blessed me with. Now, next week, because this is, Carl let me do two, I want to focus a bunch on what people that live at the well, how they treat others. Because this author argues that one of the things that's true of the new covenant is that part of the way we know how much our vertical relationship with God is in good standing is based on how well we love the people around us. And not just the people that are like us. And so that's what I'm going to talk about next week. I'd love for you to join me as we kind of continue this idea of the well and the fence. But for now, will you join me in a word of prayer?